The story that inspired The Conjuring did not originate from a desire to frighten, entertain, or even convince. It emerged from a process that moved in the opposite direction of spectacle. Long before scripts were written or audiences were imagined, the Annabelle case existed as a collection of restrained observations, recorded by individuals who understood that exaggeration was not just irresponsible, but dangerous. What made this case different from countless others was not the intensity of the events, but the discipline with which they were documented. Each detail survived because it resisted simplification. Each omission was deliberate. The real story behind Annabelle is not one of escalating terror, but of controlled attention applied to something that behaved with quiet consistency. At the beginning, there was no assumption that the case would become significant. Investigators involved were accustomed to sorting through reports that dissolved under scrutiny. Many claims of haunted objects failed quickly, collapsing once psychological factors, environmental explanations, or coincidence were introduced. The Annabelle case did not collapse. It persisted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. What drew attention was not a single event, but the way independent accounts aligned without coordination. Individuals described similar sensations without prior discussion. Emotional states shifted in parallel. Environmental discomfort appeared in spaces associated with the doll, regardless of who occupied them. These patterns did not prove anything on their own, but they resisted dismissal. Resistance to dismissal is often the first sign investigators take seriously. One of the most misunderstood elements of the case is the absence of urgency in its early stages. There was no immediate alarm, no rush to classify the situation as paranormal. Instead, there was patience. Investigators tolerated uncertainty longer than most people would. They allowed time to pass. They watched for repetition. They documented without interpretation. This approach was not passive. It was intentional. Acting too quickly risked misclassification. Misclassification could escalate a situation unnecessarily. In the Annabelle case, escalation was precisely what investigators sought to avoid. This restraint would later become a defining contrast between the real case and its cinematic reinterpretation. As documentation accumulated, a picture began to form that did not fit conventional categories. The doll itself exhibited no inherent activity. It did not move on command. It did not respond theatrically. Instead, changes occurred in proximity to it. Emotional tension increased. Sleep became irregular. Interpersonal relationships frayed without clear cause. These effects were subtle enough to be ignored individually, yet persistent enough to become undeniable collectively. This cumulative effect distinguished the case from poltergeist-style reports. There was no chaos. There was modulation. The influence appeared calibrated, operating below the threshold that would provoke immediate intervention. This pattern raised an unsettling possibility. Whatever was occurring was not uncontrolled. Investigators recognized that randomness tends to be inconsistent. What they observed instead was consistency without predictability. Effects appeared reliably, but not on a schedule. They were situational, responsive to context rather than timing. This suggested awareness. Awareness implied intent. Intent implied intelligence. These conclusions were not reached lightly. Each step required the elimination of simpler explanations. The reluctance to attribute intelligence to the phenomenon delayed classification, but it did not prevent it. Over time, the weight of repetition overcame skepticism. Another critical distinction between the real case and its later portrayal lies in the role of belief. Popular narratives often imply that fear or superstition fueled the activity. Documentation suggests the opposite. Many individuals involved were pragmatic, skeptical, and resistant to paranormal explanations. Their eventual conclusions were not driven by belief, but by exhaustion of alternatives. Mechanical explanations failed. Psychological explanations could not account for shared experiences among individuals with no emotional investment in the phenomenon. Environmental factors were examined and ruled out. What remained was not certainty, but convergence. Convergence across independent variables carries weight, even when definitive proof remains elusive. This convergence created a dilemma. Public exposure risked amplification. Silence risked neglect. Investigators chose restraint. The case circulated within limited circles, shared cautiously among those familiar with similar phenomena. There was no attempt to create narrative coherence. The documentation did not tell a story. It preserved a sequence. This distinction matters deeply. Stories impose meaning. Sequences preserve ambiguity. The Annabelle case remained ambiguous by design. Ambiguity prevented premature conclusions and discouraged casual engagement. This approach would later be misunderstood when fragments of the case reached individuals outside its original context. The transition from private documentation to public inspiration did not occur suddenly. It unfolded gradually, as certain elements of the case proved difficult to contain entirely. The doll itself became a point of reference, not because it was active, but because it was tangible. In a case defined by subtlety, the physical object provided something concrete. This tangibility made it easier to communicate the existence of the case without explaining its full complexity. Over time, the doll began to function symbolically. It represented a set of conditions rather than a source of activity. This symbolic role would later be amplified in cinematic adaptations, where visual clarity takes precedence over procedural nuance. What inspired The Conjuring at its core was not fear, but method. The investigators' refusal to dramatize, their insistence on containment over confrontation, and their acceptance of unresolved states formed the philosophical backbone of the case. They did not seek to defeat a presence. They sought to manage interaction. This mindset contradicts traditional horror narratives, which favor escalation and resolution. In reality, escalation was treated as failure. Resolution was considered unlikely. The goal was stability. Stability in this context meant minimizing influence rather than eliminating it. This emphasis on stability shaped every subsequent decision. Exposure was limited. Interaction was controlled. Documentation continued without provocation. Over time, the activity associated with the case stabilized at a low level. This stabilization did not indicate absence. It indicated equilibrium. The presence, whatever its nature, appeared responsive to reduced attention. This responsiveness reinforced earlier conclusions about the role of engagement. Attention functioned as a variable. Reducing it reduced effects. Increasing it intensified them. This relationship became one of the most important insights derived from the case. As filmmakers later encountered elements of the Annabelle documentation, they faced an unavoidable challenge. The real story did not behave like a story. It had no climax, no catharsis, no moral resolution. To adapt it, elements had to be restructured, timelines were compressed, effects were exaggerated. The doll was transformed from a conduit into a character. These changes created effective cinema, but they also obscured the true source of unease. In the real case, fear did not come from what the doll did. It came from what the situation allowed to continue. The first phase of inspiration, then, lies not in events, but in interpretation. The Annabelle case demonstrated that danger does not require visibility, and that influence does not require force. It showed that something could persist quietly, shaping behavior and environment without ever demanding attention. This realization unsettled investigators far more than any single manifestation. It suggested a model of threat that operated on patience rather than aggression. This model would later underpin the thematic tone of The Conjuring, even as the details were dramatized for effect. This is where the real story begins, not with a haunted doll, but with a disciplined refusal to look away or look too closely. A balance between observation and restraint. A recognition that some phenomena cannot be resolved, only understood well enough to manage. What inspired cinema was not the object itself, but the uncomfortable truth it revealed. That influence can exist without spectacle, and that the most enduring threats are those that do not announce themselves. What truly bridged the Annabelle case to cinematic inspiration was not a single incident, but a methodological shift that challenged how danger was defined. In documentation, investigators avoided framing the case as a confrontation. They treated it as an ongoing condition, one that required management rather than resolution. This approach ran counter to public expectations. People expect threats to escalate, to reveal themselves clearly, to demand action. The Annabelle case did none of these things. Its defining characteristic was persistence without provocation. This persistence forced investigators to reconsider what constituted risk. If something does not attack, does not escalate, and does not announce itself, does it still require containment? In this case, the answer became increasingly clear: yes. The absence of spectacle did not imply absence of intent. On the contrary, restraint suggested control. Investigators noted that the effects associated with the case appeared selectively, often following moments of engagement rather than fear. Individuals who ignored the doll entirely reported fewer disturbances. Those who lingered, out of curiosity, skepticism, or dismissal, experienced subtle but consistent effects. This correlation was documented repeatedly. Attention functioned as a trigger, not belief. This distinction matters deeply. Belief can be dismissed as subjective. Attention is measurable. Time spent near the object, frequency of discussion, and emotional investment all correlated with reported effects. The implication was unsettling. The phenomenon responded not to fear, but to focus. This insight reframed the role of the doll in the case. Annabelle was not active in the conventional sense. She did not move dramatically or communicate openly. Instead, she functioned as an anchor point, a reference that drew attention and sustained engagement. In film, this anchoring function was transformed into overt activity for narrative clarity. But in reality, the lack of movement was the most effective feature. It invited rationalization. It lowered defenses. Investigators recognized that anything overtly aggressive would have been easier to classify and remove. Subtlety preserved access. This is one of the most critical elements lost in adaptation. Cinema thrives on escalation. The real case thrived on moderation. As fragments of the case circulated beyond investigative circles, interpretation began to shift. Complexity was reduced. Ambiguity was replaced with causality. The slow accumulation of effects was compressed into discrete events. These changes made the story easier to tell, but they also altered its meaning. In documentation, the timeline stretched across months and years. Effects overlapped. Causes were inferred cautiously. In adaptation, timelines collapsed. Effects followed causes immediately. This compression created urgency but removed endurance. The real fear of the Annabelle case did not come from sudden danger. It came from prolonged uncertainty. The knowledge that something could persist indefinitely, without revealing its limits, was far more destabilizing than any single manifestation. Another divergence between reality and fiction lies in the investigator's refusal to provoke. Popular portrayals often depict investigators as actively challenging or confronting a presence. In the Annabelle case, this approach was explicitly avoided. Provocation introduced variables. Variables increased risk. Instead, investigators focused on reduction. Reduce interaction. Reduce exposure. Reduce discussion. This strategy was not rooted in superstition, but in observation. Each time engagement increased, reported effects followed. Each time engagement decreased, activity diminished. This cause and effect relationship was consistent enough to guide procedure. The goal was not to force a response, but to limit opportunity. This procedural mindset influenced how the case was later perceived by filmmakers. What they encountered was not a dramatic narrative, but a philosophy of containment. The idea that some phenomena cannot be resolved, only managed, became a thematic foundation for The Conjuring. While films dramatized this concept through confrontation and ritual, the underlying message remained: vigilance matters more than victory. Protection matters more than proof. This emphasis distinguished the Annabelle case from other paranormal stories of its time. It was not about proving the existence of something extraordinary. It was about acknowledging the limits of control. As the case continued to be referenced, another important realization emerged. The doll's appearance was incidental. Its effectiveness derived from what it represented: innocence, familiarity, harmlessness. These qualities disarmed instinctive caution. Investigators concluded that any object associated with trust could serve a similar function. The danger lay not in the object itself, but in the expectations it created. This realization broadened the implications of the case beyond Annabelle. It suggested a category of risk that operates through social and psychological norms rather than overt threat. This concept is rarely explored in popular horror, yet it is central to understanding why the case resonated so strongly. The translation of this idea into film required compromise. Visual media demands identifiable antagonists. Subtle influence is difficult to portray without internal narration or extended timelines. As a result, adaptations emphasized visible manifestations and clear causality. While effective for storytelling, this emphasis obscured the most unsettling insight derived from the real case: that danger can operate quietly, within tolerated boundaries. The Annabelle documentation did not describe a battle. It described a negotiation, a continuous adjustment of behavior in response to observed patterns. This negotiation lacked drama, but it carried weight. Over time, the case's influence extended beyond its immediate context. It shaped investigative attitudes toward similar reports. Emphasis shifted from seeking dramatic proof to identifying patterns of engagement. Investigators began to ask different questions. Not what happened, but when did attention increase? Not who believes, but who remained exposed. This shift represents one of the most lasting contributions of the Annabelle case. It provided a framework for understanding influence that does not rely on force. This framework would later inform fictional narratives, even as it remained largely invisible to audiences. The second phase of inspiration, therefore, is defined by interpretation rather than event. It marks the point at which the Annabelle case stopped being an isolated investigation and became a model. A model for how subtle phenomena might persist over time, adapting to human behavior rather than overpowering it. This is the aspect of the story that most directly inspired The Conjuring, even if it was never depicted explicitly. The films borrowed imagery and incidents, but the case offered something deeper: a lesson in restraint, patience, and the consequences of sustained attention. As the Annabelle case matured, it entered a phase that was never meant to be visible outside investigative circles. This phase was defined not by new events, but by refinement of understanding. By this point, investigators were no longer asking whether something anomalous was present. That question had been functionally answered through repetition and convergence. The more difficult question became how the phenomenon sustained itself without escalation. This question mattered because it challenged the dominant assumption that danger must intensify to remain relevant. Annabelle contradicted that assumption entirely. The case demonstrated that persistence, not progression, could be the primary mechanism of influence. During this period, the documentation shifted focus. Early records emphasized observation. Later records emphasized correlation. Investigators began mapping patterns of engagement rather than cataloging incidents. They noted who approached the object, how long exposure lasted, and what emotional or cognitive effects followed. Over time, a clear structure emerged. Effects did not correlate with fear. They correlated with familiarity. Individuals who became comfortable around the doll, treating it as background rather than anomaly, were more likely to report disturbances. This finding was counterintuitive. Comfort is typically associated with safety. In this case, comfort lowered vigilance. Lowered vigilance increased exposure. Exposure sustained influence. This cycle became one of the most important insights derived from the case. The realization that familiarity could be a liability marked a turning point. It reframed the nature of the threat. The entity associated with Annabelle did not benefit from panic. Panic shortened interaction. It benefited from normalization. Normalization extended presence. This insight directly contradicted common horror narratives, which portray fear as the catalyst for danger. In the real case, fear was often protective. It prompted withdrawal. It reduced engagement. Calm curiosity, on the other hand, prolonged contact. This distinction is subtle, but it fundamentally alters how the case must be understood. The threat was not reactive. It was opportunistic. As investigators internalized this pattern, procedural changes followed. Interaction protocols became stricter. Casual proximity was discouraged. Discussion of the case was limited to necessity. The goal was not secrecy for its own sake, but reduction of cognitive engagement. Investigators observed that even indirect attention, extended conversation, speculation, or repeated review of the case appeared to correlate with increased psychological effects. This observation reinforced earlier conclusions. Attention itself functioned as a vector. The phenomenon did not require physical contact. Awareness alone was often sufficient. This understanding placed significant responsibility on those managing the case. They were not merely containing an object. They were managing information. This information-based risk posed a unique challenge. Unlike physical hazards, it could not be mitigated through barriers alone. Glass cases, locked rooms, and controlled environments addressed proximity, but not curiosity. Curiosity traveled easily. It moved through conversation, rumor, and speculation. Investigators recognized that complete elimination of curiosity was unrealistic. Instead, they aimed to control framing. The case was described clinically, without dramatic language. Emotional responses were downplayed. Speculation was avoided. This restrained framing served a protective function. It reduced the likelihood of fixation. This approach would later be partially preserved in cinematic adaptations through a serious procedural tone, even as individual scenes were dramatized. Another significant development during this phase was the recognition that the Annabelle case did not stand alone. Similar patterns began to surface in unrelated investigations. Objects associated with gradual psychological influence, environments that felt subtly altered rather than overtly hostile, individuals reporting persistent unease without identifiable cause. These similarities suggested a broader category of phenomena operating under shared principles. Annabelle became a reference point, not because it was unique, but because it was well documented. The case provided a framework for interpreting other reports that might otherwise have been dismissed. This broader relevance elevated its importance beyond its original context. What unsettled investigators most was the apparent absence of deterioration over time. Many phenomena diminish, attention fades, effects weaken. The Annabelle case did neither. It remained stable. Stability implied sustainability. Sustainability implied long-term intent. The entity associated with the doll appeared content with maintaining a low-level presence indefinitely. This patience contrasted sharply with human expectations of conflict and resolution. Investigators noted that the phenomenon did not appear constrained by urgency. It did not need to act quickly. Time itself seemed to function as an ally. This realization forced a reevaluation of risk assessment. A threat that does not expire cannot be waited out. It must be managed continuously. This long-term perspective is rarely captured in fictional portrayals. Films operate on finite arcs. Stories end. The real Annabelle case did not offer that luxury. It demanded ongoing vigilance without the promise of closure. This aspect profoundly influenced those involved. Managing an unresolved situation over extended periods produced psychological strain distinct from acute crises. There was no release, no conclusion, only maintenance. This strain contributed to the seriousness with which the case was treated. It was not dramatic, but it was exhausting. And exhaustion can be as dangerous as fear. As the case informed investigative philosophy, it also shaped how inspiration was interpreted. Filmmakers encountering the documentation were drawn not only to the events, but to the mindset they reflected. The refusal to escalate, the emphasis on boundaries, the acceptance of uncertainty. These elements resonated because they subverted genre expectations. Horror traditionally relies on revelation. The Annabelle case relied on restraint. This inversion created a unique tension that filmmakers sought to capture, even if it required exaggeration for visual clarity. The real lesson, however, remained embedded in the documentation rather than the dramatization. The third phase of the Annabelle story, then, is defined by normalization of vigilance. The case ceased to feel extraordinary to those managing it, not because it was resolved, but because it was integrated into routine. This integration was both necessary and unsettling. Necessary, because constant alarm is unsustainable. Unsettling, because routine can dull caution. Investigators were acutely aware of this risk. Procedures were designed to counter complacency. Regular review, reinforcement of boundaries, minimal exposure. These measures did not eliminate the presence. They constrained it. Constraint became the closest equivalent to safety available. This phase reveals the deepest divergence between reality and fiction. In cinema, danger escalates until it is confronted or destroyed. In the Annabelle case, danger stabilized and endured. It demanded discipline rather than heroism, patience rather than action. The influence persisted not because it was unstoppable, but because it operated within tolerated limits. Understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding what truly inspired The Conjuring. The films may depict climactic confrontations, but the real story is one of prolonged management, a recognition that some threats do not seek domination. They seek continuity. The final stage of understanding in the Annabelle case did not arrive through revelation, but through acceptance. By the time investigators reached this phase, the question was no longer whether the phenomenon was real, nor whether it posed a risk. Both had been established through years of consistent documentation. The remaining challenge was more difficult, determining how a situation with no clear endpoint could be responsibly maintained. This is the aspect of the case most often absent from fictional portrayals. Stories demand conclusions. Real cases sometimes demand endurance. The Annabelle case belonged to the latter category. Its persistence forced those involved to confront the limits of intervention and the cost of continued vigilance. One of the most important conclusions reached during this phase was that resolution was not only unlikely but potentially dangerous to pursue. Attempts to eliminate the object entirely introduced unknown variables. Destruction carried the risk of release. Relocation carried the risk of exposure. Public disclosure carried the risk of amplification. Each option presented consequences that could not be reliably predicted. In contrast, containment, imperfect as it was, offered stability. Stability allowed patterns to remain consistent. Consistency allowed management. This pragmatic calculus guided every subsequent decision. The absence of a definitive solution was not a failure of investigation. It was an acknowledgement of reality. As the case settled into long-term containment, procedures became increasingly precise. Interaction was reduced to necessity. Exposure was minimized. Documentation continued, but without experimentation. The goal was not discovery, but preservation of boundaries. Over time, the activity associated with the case stabilized at a low, predictable level. This stability was often misunderstood by outsiders as inactivity. Investigators rejected this interpretation. Dormancy was not absence. It was equilibrium. The presence had not disappeared. It had adjusted to the constraints imposed upon it. This adjustment reinforced earlier conclusions about its adaptive nature. The phenomenon responded to limits, not challenges. The psychological impact of managing such a case over extended periods cannot be overstated. Unlike acute crises, which demand immediate action and then resolve, prolonged containment requires sustained discipline. There is no catharsis, no confirmation of success, only the ongoing responsibility of maintenance. Investigators described a persistent background tension, not fear, but awareness. A constant reminder that failure would not be dramatic, but incremental. Boundaries could erode gradually. Procedures could become routine. Complacency posed a greater risk than panic. This understanding shaped the culture surrounding the case. Seriousness replaced alarm. Routine replaced reaction. This long-term perspective fundamentally altered how the Annabelle case influenced later narratives. Filmmakers encountering the documentation were struck not only by the events described, but by the absence of resolution. The real story offered no triumph, no definitive victory over evil. Instead, it presented a model of coexistence under constraint. This model conflicted with traditional horror storytelling, which relies on escalation and closure. To adapt the case for cinema, resolution had to be manufactured. Conflicts had to be sharpened. Endings had to be provided. While these choices created compelling films, they also obscured the most unsettling truth revealed by the real case, that some threats persist precisely because they do not demand confrontation. Another critical realization during this phase concerned the role of human behavior in sustaining the phenomenon. Investigators concluded that the presence associated with Annabelle did not operate independently. It required interaction, even if minimal. Attention, curiosity, and dismissal all functioned as forms of engagement. The case demonstrated that neutrality is not always passive. Choosing not to disengage can be a form of participation. This insight reframed responsibility. The danger was not solely external. It existed in the relationship between observer and object. Managing the case required managing behavior as much as environment. This relational aspect of the threat is rarely explored in popular culture. Horror often externalizes danger, placing it firmly outside the self. The Annabelle case complicated this framework. It suggested that influence could operate through ordinary human tendencies: curiosity, skepticism, familiarity. These tendencies are not inherently dangerous, yet in this context, they facilitated persistence. This realization forced investigators to adopt a more introspective approach. Procedures were designed not only to restrict access to the object, but to regulate their own engagement. Self-discipline became a containment strategy. As the years passed, the case's public image diverged further from its documented reality. Annabelle became a symbol of overt evil in popular imagination. The real case remained defined by restraint. This divergence created a paradox. The more sensational the public narrative became, the less it reflected the actual source of concern. Investigators understood that dramatization, while culturally inevitable, reduced the likelihood that the real lesson would be understood. That lesson was not about fear of the unknown. It was about respect for boundaries. The danger was not that something existed beyond explanation. The danger was that it could exist indefinitely within tolerated limits. The final assessment of the Annabelle case does not offer reassurance. It offers clarity. The story that inspired The Conjuring was never about defeating a possessed object. It was about recognizing the conditions under which influence persists. Annabelle herself was incidental. Any object associated with trust and familiarity could have served the same function. The case exposed a vulnerability not in environments, but in perception. By appearing harmless, the object bypassed instinctive defenses. By remaining subtle, the phenomenon avoided decisive response. This combination proved more effective than overt aggression. In the end, the case remains unresolved by design. Resolution would imply finality, and finality has never been demonstrated. What exists instead is a sustained state of management, a recognition that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed without consequence. They can only be guarded. Guarding requires discipline, patience, and an acceptance of uncertainty. This is the aspect of the story that rarely survives adaptation, yet it is the most important. The real story behind what inspired The Conjuring does not conclude with victory or defeat. It concludes with responsibility. The responsibility to maintain boundaries long after attention has faded, and to understand that the absence of spectacle does not equal the absence of risk.